everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Community ChronicILLS. I actually remembered the title of the podcast this time. All right, today we are here with Iman, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Iman. I'm in my early 20s. I've had chronic illnesses for about the past 6 years. I recently started using the term disabled to
Describe
blanking, brain fog. Yep.
I got you.
Myself, and yeah, I've kind of been more, I guess, active in the community, connecting with people, and so I'm happy to be here.
That's awesome. And I guess today we're going to talk about grief with chronic illness. And I guess, would you kind of tell us what grief with chronic illness is to you?
Yes, I think this has been something that I've been working through the past years, and recently has just kind of hit me, I think. I feel like for a while I was kind of in the mindset of like, oh, I need to figure out what's going on, I need to cope. And like, that was the past few years, and I was just kind of focusing on that. And once I started to kind of learn how to manage things, it was more so my brain started realizing like, oh, there's a lot of emotions here that you haven't really let out because you've been so focused on surviving.
Right.
And so like with all the doctor appointments and everything, I never had a chance to like breathe and realize like, oh, this is a lot to suddenly happen out of nowhere. And I never really got to process that.
Sure.
So I guess like when the pandemic hit, I kind of got more aware of like, oh, I've been home alone for a long time, kind of isolated. And now the whole world is doing it too. And that's interesting to realize because I'm like, oh, I kind of knew that this was happening to me, but to see everyone else grieving this, I realized I never grieved it myself.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone was asking me like, how did you do this? How did you get through this? And I was thinking like, I don't think I ever processed it because it wasn't a choice. It wasn't a choice for anyone else either. But for me, I think I kind of wasn't well enough to go to school. I wasn't well enough to be outside of the house. So it was different in the way that my body is what isolated me versus like the government telling me to stay home.
I remember in the pandemic, like everybody was complaining and I'm like, welcome to my world, bitch. I was saying that over and over again.
Me too.
Well, yeah, and I think it's a big thing when you have to do it by yourself and you have to see everybody else, kind of, whatever, living the life you want or what, what I mean, whatever you were used to. And it's different when you're kind of by yourself and when everybody got thrown into it at the same time. You're like, oh, okay. You know what I mean? Everyone was kind of going through the same thing at the same time.
Yeah, it definitely hit me because I think my family started to process it, be like, oh my goodness, this is so hard. Like they knew it was hard for me, but like, my dad had to work from home. My brother started having to work, do school from home. And it was just like, everyone was home. And that was different for me too, because I was used to being home, but it was just me. So I was like, oh, there's more people around now. I have to deal with that as well. So that was a work in progress for all of us. And I do think it brought us closer and led to lots of fights as well. But it did get me to connect to the community through all of that because in the middle of the pandemic, I got diagnosed with an eating disorder, and I kind of was feeling really alone in that. It's specifically ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which isn't as recognized. So I didn't really have anyone to support me. So I decided to see like, oh, if anyone else online could, support me or I could learn from anyone.
Sure.
And so then I started meeting people, and over time I started opening about chronic illnesses and disabilities and things too. And that's really how I connected to more people and found the community. And I'm really glad I did that because I really don't think that the grieving process is, it's never easy, but it's definitely a lot harder when you don't have a community with you.
Sure, 100%. And I think like, it's so interesting to me because I would say up until like the last year or so, I was active on social media, but not in the like chronic illness community on social media. I've always been like, for the past like 4 or 5 years, been a part of like a Facebook group for narcolepsy. That's a medication specific group. But other than that, like I had never engrossed myself in that. And I've always hated social media. And since like getting involved in the chronic illness community on social media, like why did I never connect the dots that like, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Where like, oh no, like this can be used in a positive way, because I think I didn't like social media because I just didn't feel like I could relate to a lot of my peers that I was seeing, you know, like they're doing all these fun things, and I'm back. And then, you know,
Yeah.
you get to your chronic illness niche. And I think my like experience with it kind of started on TikTok, like because it's so niche specific. And then I was like, oh, I wonder if this exists on Instagram too. And so like getting into that niche has been so helpful and like healing.
I also think there's been a lot of change in the way social media has been with, especially in the chronic illness community. I feel like before there was a lot of negativity about chronic illness, and now I feel like over the last couple of years it's really changed to be more positive. Obviously there's still the negativity, but there's a lot more positivity, like, you know, like these groups like, you know, your page and Carmen's and all these different ones that are bringing that positivity to the world. And it's kind of, I think it's changed.
Because I used to avoid like the Facebook groups and stuff because it would all just be so dark and depressing, and like it was like a competition of like, well, my lupus caused a collapsed lung, my lupus caused me to go into heart failure. And I remember being like a 17-year-old being like, oh my god, I'm gonna die tomorrow.
And it's terrifying.
It was awful. And I'm so glad that, you know, the cultures kind of started to change. And, you know, I've realized like grieving in that context is so much easier. It like helped me realize like, okay, no, like there's a collective grief kind of happening. And these are valid things to like have to process, if that makes sense. I struggle like giving myself permission to like feel my feelings.
Me too.
And so like being a part of that and like seeing there's so many like amazing like informational posts and things like that. And you know, it just is really I've always been chronically ill, but I probably, and Kyle would agree most likely, I haven't like I didn't start processing everything until like the last year to 18 months. I just was like a brick wall, no emotion. Like I would get diagnosed, my mom would be in tears, and I would just be like, I'd have like meltdowns like every 3 months.
Yeah.
But never like tied the emotion to
what causes it.
And so that's when you wanted to talk about grief, I was so excited because
I think
it's such a process.
Yeah, I think the biggest like misconception people have about grief, with me specifically, is I don't cry like a lot of the time. And so nobody ever realized that I was like struggling, because like I even had a therapist tell me like, oh, you know, don't worry because I'll know if you're not okay. And I was like, oh, okay. And now I'm like, no, I don't think that's really that true, because I have been struggling. I just convinced myself I wasn't to keep going, and to tell myself like, oh, you know, you can't be weak, and all these things that really didn't help me. They hurt me more.
Sure.
And I think what you were saying about online, like for me, I think like before I started getting involved, I had kind of seen the community and like kind of see, like I hadn't really interacted, but I was kind of like looking at certain pages that made me feel like, oh, I'm understood here. And I think that if I had decided to get involved in that, like when I first got diagnosed, that wouldn't have been a good idea for me. And I think most people, when you're really young, it can be really overwhelming and almost like an unsafe thing, because you have to really know your limits, your boundaries, and everything, because you know, it's still online. You don't know what you want to share. You don't know if people's grief is going to be too much for you. You have to know how to balance all of that. And I feel like even now it's really difficult. But the collective grieving definitely has been really helpful for me, because I am able to allow myself to grieve more if like other people are. Mm-hmm. And I think I was so used to other people around me telling me that they're okay, and that, you know, I can be okay too, or that they need me to be okay, that I just didn't allow myself or even process that I needed it. Mm-hmm. Like I said, including doctors, they were like, oh, you know, it's okay. You're okay because other people are crying. like I have patients that come in crying. I'm like, okay, well, I'm coming in pain. Just because I'm not crying doesn't mean it's not hurting, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think the invalidation, the medical gaslighting and all that stuff definitely made me just like suppress the grief until it got to a level where I guess my body was just like, nope, you have to experience it now. I'm like, oh, okay, there it is. You know, it's out there.
I call myself a closet crier because I don't like people to see me upset. And so like I will go into I'm very like sensory sensitive. And so I'll go into a room. I like where have you tucked up when I tucked up. I'll like go into my closet because I feel the most secure and I don't like people to know that I've been crying. It's just not my thing. And so when I would previously like experience my emotions, like it was always like almost in a very like shameful way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I didn't show it outwardly, but also like I felt so alone in my grief when I did experience it that I would have such dark thoughts because I thought I was the only person that was feeling this way.
Yeah. I think like one of the hardest things is people will tell me like, oh, what can I do? And I didn't know for the longest time. So, you know, they just keep trying. And now I kind of know some things that can be supportive when I'm grieving. A lot of the time it is just letting me be what I am, even if they're uncomfortable. And if they're uncomfortable with it, then I'm like, okay, then maybe you're not the person that can grieve with me, you know?
Right.
And setting that boundary because it's better than someone invalidating me because that's what makes them feel comfortable.
Right.
Even if like it's unintentional, like you said. But I think starting to recognize those boundaries has helped me with my family and my friends to kind of allow myself to grieve and have support in a way that is more like beneficial for me to just grieve the way I need to, or, you know, as I'm figuring it out, because it can change all the time. Like you said about the crying thing, like I did not like telling people I was crying. I also felt invalidated by telling people I didn't cry because then they're like, oh my gosh, how do you not cry? Like you're never okay. Like I don't know.
I feel nothing.
No, I'm like very numb. And when I was told by someone that no, depression, like one of the biggest signs of depression is being numb, that was really validating for me because in my head, I kept telling myself like, no, I don't go through this because I don't cry. How could I possibly be grieving or depressed if I'm not crying, if I'm not feeling hopeless and expressing it? But I think really what it was just like survival mode. I was just going and just numb to it because that's what I knew I had to do. And I think I was scared to stop because I knew it was going to hit me.
Sure.
So when things forcefully made me to stop, either my body in a crash or the pandemic, like it woke me up to reality. I was like, oh yeah, it's still very much there. You know, as soon as like a flare ends, I can feel all my emotions coming back because they kind of get numbed out when I'm in a crash. All my focus is set on like how to take care of my body and get through the flare up. Like I need rest, I need to put a heating pad, I need medication. But as soon as those things go down, the emotions all pop up and it's like I'm suddenly in a flare up with my emotions instead. Yes. And for me personally, I struggle a lot more with mental like struggles than physical in a lot of ways with my comfort level because there's no heating pad, ice pack, or anything for like your mental health. And so I like can kind of cope with it. If it's like pain, I'm like, okay, I can wrap it or something. But when it's like my thoughts and they're intrusive or invalidating, I have a really hard time just like calming that down. It usually just kind of spirals.
One thing my therapist kind of walked through with me at one point was I like could always communicate that like my disease was flared, but she's like, Maddie, your anxiety flares. And when I get anxious, like it's almost like I get this anxiety on top of anxiety about like I'm going to be anxious and feel this way forever. And she's like, you need to think of this as a flare in your emotions. Like this isn't permanent. This is gonna, you know, resolve itself. But okay, you have a procedure like set of steps. You have a procedure for when your body is flaring. Let's make a procedure for when your mind is flaring. And that like a lot of times, like, I'll be really anxious and talk to Kyle, and he'll be like, it's just a flare. It's just a flare. And so, like, I think reframing those things in the context that you understand can be really helpful, at least for me personally.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny that you had someone tell you, like, that because you weren't crying all the time, like, you were fine or whatever, or you were dealing with things really well. Because, like, I've had 2 therapists tell me, like, yeah, I knew things were really bad because your emotions and the facts weren't in alignment. Like, because, like, I would be talking about something that happened that was, like, really traumatic, and I'd be like, yeah, but it's gonna be fine. And, like, they're like, that's a sign of trauma and that you're not coping. And I was like, whoa, okay.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what happened to me recently too. I kind of had a therapist just tell me like, oh, you've experienced a lot of medical trauma. I was like, oh, have I? And everyone was like, of course you have. What do you mean? I'm like, oh, yeah, I don't know how I didn't process that's the case. I think I thought, like, that must be so much worse than what I'm going through. This can't be medical trauma, because we love to compare.
It could be worse game.
Yeah.
And I think it's just one of those things that, like, especially like physical health is kind of what you've always, like, you start with a doctor. Oh, okay, here's a medication for this. But I mean, obviously, again, until recently, like, the mental health wasn't something that most people would, I guess, give you as, like, to help, yeah, if you're flaring, here's medication. But they never, oh, hey, I'm having a bunch of anxiety. They didn't give you the tools to do that. They were just like, oh, well, you're fine, or here's medication. That it was very much like medication, and not the tools to help you solve that.
Yeah, like, I didn't know where the core issues were coming from, and so, like, I didn't know where it was stemming from. Like, I didn't know anything about where the anxiety was from, and it's such a big scope of things. Like, it could be so many conditions, so many situations, and, like, really having to go through that in therapy, I think, is what has allowed me to realize a little bit more about that. And it can be traumatic in itself to recognize that as well, because then you just, like, spiraling about that. And I think recently, like you were saying, I have been making, like, a list to refer to of, like, kind of in order of what things I can try. So I know I have a list. I'm not at my last, like, resort, of, like, when I go through a mental health flare. And that really helps me. I think one of the most recent things I've been doing has just been to, like, have company or ask for help, which is really uncomfortable for me. So, like, calling a friend or having my mom come spend time with me and just sitting. Like, things that people don't really offer because they're so simple, but yet they can be what helps me get through, because it's not like you're alone. Like, it doesn't have to be sitting and doing something with me. It could just be, like, being there, having someone present to remind me that I'm present, because sometimes I don't feel present. Yeah.
100%. And I just think that, the whole grieving process of chronic illness is so complicated, because and when you think about it in the context of, PTSD, you have all of these moments of severe and intense trauma, and then you're having this overarching trauma while you're trying to cope with those severe, like, intermittent events. And it's so complicated. And, like, I get really bad around traumaversaries. Like, that is my worst time. And so it's been interesting, because when I was like, I feel attacked.
Well, how am I supposed to feel in this moment? Ganja, I didn't want to make it that everybody was attacking you. I feel very attacked.
It's okay, me too. I'm like that too.
I'm just trying to validate her feelings.
Validation can be like an attack sometimes, because we're kind of in denial.
Oh, shit. Okay, so I've been doing this thing lately. I need you to just shut your mouth for a second, okay? Just turn around. Don't let me see your reaction. Where like I try to like be like, I'll be going through like this flare and I'll be like, okay, like why am I so anxious? And like I'll be like, oh, that's because like this happened on this exact time. Hop always does me dirty. Like, let me tell you, like Snapchat memories, not good, not your friend.
No.
And it'll always be like a picture of me in an ambulance on like the third day of me feeling like shit mentally. And I'm like, oh right, yeah. And when you like figure out the cause of your flare, I do the same thing with my chronic illness. Like, I'm like, okay, so what caused this? Because I'm a mess. And something could not just happen sporadically or without cause. Like there has to be a purpose in my brain, very black and white. And so when I figure out like that root of the problem, it's almost like a grieving process of the fact that I figured out what was causing it.
Oh, that is so true. Yeah, I'm very similar to that. I don't like looking at like, I don't like being reminded of like memories or things like that. But you know, going to doctor appointments, they're always asking you your medical history. And it's like you're constantly re-dramatized by everything. And like the same thing when you see a new therapist, they're like, oh, so tell me about everything that's happened in your life. I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that again.
And then I hate having all the opinions. Like that's the hard, like, especially like when my brain is foggy, like if I'm like trying to like retell my medical history and the doctor's like, well, that doesn't add up, or like, why would the doctor do that? I'm like, I'm just trying my best.
Like this is where we're at. Can you just like accept where we're at? Can you be a listener right now? Like you have to ears constantly. Yeah. No, I feel like they need that advice so much because I don't know if they know that we are the ones that experience it. They're just the ones that are kind of there. It's not them knowing everything and us just being there for them to critique us.
Yeah, we were just trying to survive. We didn't know why they did some of the things they do.
Yeah, and we probably didn't even realize at the time. I know I didn't. And to have a doctor be like, oh yeah, that was wrong is actually sometimes like, oh, okay, well, I thought it was wrong. And then a doctor told me it wasn't. And now I have to go back on that.
Right.
It's so hard.
It's a hot mess.
There's like so many layers because one of the things I always think is about how it's like trauma, you're healing from trauma, like the 5 things I guess that people talk about. It's going through it over and over again with each flare up, with each diagnosis, with each experience. And it's like, how do I reach acceptance when I'm getting there, something else hits, or, you know, something else becomes more prominent. And it's just like, to allow yourself, I guess, permission to grieve while knowing that you can accept it as well. And that you can kind of be in both forever. Like it's okay to not have like an endpoint because it's not going to be that way. And yeah, it's not linear.
No, 100%. And another thing like that I find really interesting, because like PTSD, like the way the brain processes trauma is just so fascinating to me. Yeah. And medical PTSD is the cause of so many, like your likelihood if you have one autoimmune disease to get another autoimmune disease, you know, is so much greater and so forth. And all of those incidences of trauma and lack of coping mechanisms is what can make you sicker. Not necessarily like, you know, I would always ask like, especially like having a neurological condition, like with my narcolepsy, like it's pretty entertaining because they're like, it's all in your head. I'm like, well, technically, yes. That is where my brain sits. Yeah. So
I'm still just so surprised. Like a doctor will send you like a referral to a specialist, but I don't know if I've ever had a doctor or heard of a doctor saying like, oh, hey, like I'm going to push you towards a therapist. Like, you know what I mean? Like
Dr. Codegall.
Dr. Codegall. Oh, well,
that's because he's the best.
I've had some do that too. And like, it's like, I know they have to ask about your mental health, but it's almost like they expect a therapist to just take care of all of that. But I think doctors really need to take an aspect of that too, because you cannot treat someone with chronic illness or any type of pain without bringing the mental part up. Like everyone is going to have some component of that. There is no person who is just strong enough, quote unquote, because our bodies, I guess, is what I'm learning, is our bodies remember the trauma. Even when my mind doesn't fully, like I can feel it in my body, or even like, even if I don't think something's going to trigger me, it's like suddenly my body remembers what's happened, and I might not piece it together until way later, but my body remembers. And I think that doctors don't think about that enough or talk about it enough.
And I think, you know, there is a shift happening right now in medicine where people are looking at the whole body, but it's a slow adoption. And like, it gives me hope that that's starting to happen, but there's so much more that needs to. I flare cyclically. Like I can tell when I'm going to flare because of the way my body remembers that this happened around this date. And it's so fascinating. And that's why I like to like make notes or keep track of like different, like I literally have in my phone like a notes section that's like traumaversaries, and like that way
me too.
When something happens, I can be like, okay, no, like this is okay, I've gotten through it before. Because that's so much of chronic illness, is like it's a battle with your mind and your body, because so much of fighting is, you know, mental, and taking your medications sometimes is triggering. Like remaining compliant is a struggle. And I think when your body knows that you're feeling like you want to give up, I feel like it acts up even more. Like your body needs your brain has to be in the fight with your body.
Right. And I think like healthy people, like when they grieve, like, you know, they can just be off of their schedule a little bit, but I cannot do that for like even a day, because my body will get worse. My mind will struggle more. And sometimes I wish I could grieve in like the way that they could. Like I could just sleep all day or something, but no, I have to wake up, I have to take my medicines, I have to make sure I still see my doctor, you know? And it's like, to do those extra things on top of going through that is so much, because it sends you right back into it again. So you don't really get that break or vacation that like people say they need, because our body and our mind don't stop fighting.
100%. I'm always like, I need a timeout. Like if I'll I'll be crying. I'll be like, can I get a timeout? Can life just time out for a second? Like I don't need it to quit, but just like.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful for those times when like I can sleep, because that's the only time when I'm like, okay. And sometimes I have like dreams about it, and I'm just like, please, no. We're not gonna have that right now.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just like a me thing, like especially like when you're saying like taking a break. I think for me it's more helpful sometimes to take like a day off here or a day off there, because a lot of people are like, oh, I just need a vacation. And it's like, well, I'll go on a week-long vacation. It's like, oh, it's great. But like, I'm like, all right, cool. I didn't have the stress of work, or I didn't have this, whatever. But then I get right back into it. And it's exactly, you know what I'm saying? It's like, all right, I still, you know, I'm still tired as hell. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like I get refreshed kind of thing. Or
I'll be even more stressed than I'm behind on like chores or.
Yeah, or just like knowing that you have to get back to it, and like, oh, my week is over. Now I have to get back to everything else I go through usually, even though it never really stopped.
Nope.
I think that is like so hard.
And I think and I think that sometimes it's just like so helpful for like just to have those days sometimes. Just to sit down and then like you know, getting back to the grief part is like having that constant, like, I guess grieving, you know, keeping that in and just like constantly trying to progress yourself as best as you can to, like, you know, obviously things come up and it's just like remembering to, you know, trying to grow as much as possible in that grief, just every day, you know, whatever, you know, obviously not every day,
right, but I think the biggest thing is to know that you're like, you deserve to grieve, like no matter what you're going through. You also deserve to be happy while you're going through the grieving process. Like if you are happy for a second, it doesn't mean that you're failing your grieving process. Like, you know, I think people assume it's either just like laying in bed crying or being happy, and it's not like that. It's like mixed. And I think with chronic illness, especially, like it took me a long time to realize I even deserved to feel joy because I felt awful all the time. Like, oh, if I feel joy, then I should probably just be fine. But that's not how it works. And I think, again, that's very invalidating of our grief. And like, forget everyone else. Our bodies and our minds are invalidating our grief enough. Like, we're constantly.
Well, and like, I think a lot of that stems from, like, for example, people would always think that like what was going on with me, like, oh, Maddie was faking it, or blah, 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 blah. And I think when like I would experience those highs amongst the lows, that's when people would try to invalidate my experience and be like, well, if you're doing this today, then why couldn't you, like, especially with work, like if you are, like, I would always have like a bad flare day and then come to work like cheery and with a positive attitude. You're like, well, if you're like feeling fine today, then why couldn't you come in yesterday? It's like, chronic illness doesn't make sense. So
no, it doesn't. There's no logic to it. I feel like you can't make sense of it, and it's really hard. But I think one of the things that people don't realize is sometimes I have the hardest time on my good days just because of how invalidated I feel, how people are constantly telling me like everything I can do now that I'm better, or like planning out my life for me just because I'm like finally okay for a second. And I get scared to even just see people sometimes because I'm like, oh my goodness. But I'm getting better at it. I know my boundaries. It's just like at first I was like, oh my gosh, like if I'm like even just a little bit different than what they saw me as the other day, it's going to be like a big jump. And I also did it to myself. But I think as I learn, my people and my surroundings learn as well. And it's been a journey for all of us. And I think that's another big part, is just having a community, having a support system that can be your family, can be not, and can be online, can be not, and just kind of leaning on them, but also accepting that like they're going through it with you too, and it's not going to be perfect for any of you. Like, we're all learning, and like it's good intentions. It might also hurt. You might hurt each other, but you'll figure it out because you're really just trying to be there for each other.
Yeah, and I think that's like a big part of my grieving process. Kind of what you said earlier. Like, my biggest thing is like just being present and like, like, okay, this is where I was. This is how I feel now. Like, okay, I need to, if I'm sad at the moment, like, all right, it's okay to be sad. Or if I'm happy, like, that's still kind of part of my grieving process of like understanding, like, I didn't have a good day, but like, hey, I'm sitting here, I feel good. Like, I'm happy for where I'm at right now, and just kind of being present in that moment. Yeah, it's a gratitude. And just like, that's a big part of it. Whatever feeling, it could be any emotion at that point, but yeah.
The biggest thing like that people talk about with gratitude is like, I think sometimes people make it like we should only feel gratitude, but I do think a component of gratitude is really important, because I've always had people trying to tell me to recognize my wins. If you want to celebrate everyone else, you need to celebrate you too. And it's still something I'm working on, but like within the eating disorder community, I've learned that a lot of people do that just in general, because it's so hard to just like, okay, what can I do today to get through this meal? What can I, like, just the little things that they do. And I started doing that just like with everything. And I think it's really helpful to just be like, you know what, today I, got through this meal, or I was sitting in bed. And it's just like very different than I guess how I used to think of wins being like healthy people wins, which I couldn't relate to anymore. I had to like adapt them for me. And it took time to like feel like, okay, that's enough. And it's still hard, but I think it does help me get through the day knowing that, hey, like just being here is a win because I'm still fighting. And like that can take everything in us just to do that, just to exist.
And I think a big thing is like having that gratitude and understanding that you don't have to have that gratitude all the time. Because I think that mindset becomes, either toxic or you gaslight yourself, where that's where you get to, oh, well, it could be worse, oh, I'm grateful for that, whatever, I don't have this or I don't have that. And I think it's important to have that gratitude, but you also have to allow yourself to be like, wow, this, this sucks. This sucks. This is stupid. But also then, coming back to the positives and you know, being like, it's having all the emotions and being okay with that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you know, trying to be as positive as possible.
I think sometimes resilience is a better word than positive almost.
Yeah,
like
resilience.
just that, okay, like this knocked me on my ass, but I'm gonna get up anyways. And Kyle taught me something. Kyle, talk about what you taught me.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing, like when you said,
I struggle with motivation lately.
Yeah, like you said, like
me too.
Like the little wins, like I try to work out as much as possible, even though I don't feel like it. But like my biggest thing is like if I go home, if I sit down, that's the hardest thing. Like I try not to sit down, but if I sit down, I'm like, okay, I just gotta get to the car. Like if I can get dressed and get to the car, I get to the mindset of like, well, I'm already here. I would have just wasted all that energy to get ready and get to the car if I don't just go to the gym. So I might as well go. And it's like, those, you know, those little hacks that, you know, whatever it may be, if it's, okay, I just got to get to the kitchen to make food. You know what it is? Oh, I just got to put it in the oven. Wherever that milestone is, that just kind of gets you over that hump of, I just don't want to do it. And it's like breaking it down into little goals and those little wins that, you know, kind of push you to doing what you need to do, or
getting out of bed.
That's
if I take my covers off the bed,
oh my god, I'm cold.
I have to turn like my heating pad on just so I can be like, I don't know, a little bit warmer, or just have like a little less pain to get out of bed for a second, go brush my teeth, and then come back. I'm like, okay, I did that. Okay, now what? And I think like there's another thing, I guess, of just like things to look forward to. I mean, there's not always something I feel like I can mentally process that I can look forward to. But lately for me, I've just loved that time of day where the sun just shines through my room. So like, oh, you know, it's almost going to be like 4:00 and then my room will be like full of light. And that's like a good time for me because I feel like just kind of warm and like, it's just a nice moment. And it's like, does not last very long, but it's just like, okay, you know what? That's enough to look forward to for today. It might not be something big. And I think like, just adjusting what my goals and what my wins are just definitely changed how I saw myself, and like as like a failure, as like, no, this is not failing. Like if you're here, you're still going.
Right. 100%. I like to bribe myself. Like,
that's
if I go to work today, then I'm gonna go home, and a lot of times I bribe myself with dessert or bread in general.
Bread's good.
My other thing lately has been like, okay, if I do this, then I'm gonna go get some new yarn because I've been hyper fixating on crocheting lately.
Cool.
So I like to bribe myself with that stuff. But another thing I like to try to do to like give my mind and body like a chance to catch its breath, which sometimes works better than others, but like I format my week as like a unit to win, if that makes sense. Like, okay, like I'm not gonna win the month, that's for sure, but like a good week, if that makes sense. And like Sundays are my days to like feel everything, to decompress, like to reset. And I've found that it used to be like I was go no matter what, like even though my body doesn't really like work with that mindset, that was how I was. And I started giving myself permission to like just take Sundays to like have a minute, and that has helped a lot, because I've always been someone that like pushes myself and then gets sick because I push myself, which is, you know, something we're trying to overcome, but sometimes interesting. And like giving yourself permission to like set those boundaries so that you can grieve a little less. Like, my friends will invite me out sometimes, and like, I'm like, okay, like I want to go out to make them happy, but at the same time, I know that like if I come home late tonight, then I'm not going to feel rested. I'm not going to have a good week the next week. Like giving myself permission to like say no, so that then I don't have to deal with the consequences of my actions on top of all,
yes,
all of the rest, has been really, really helpful.
Me too. I've definitely had to learn how to say no, including doctor appointments. I have not been going to the doctor very often right now because it's just like so much. Because as you were saying, I have been dealing with a trauma anniversary date, and I'm just like, I cannot take all this extra stuff on top of it. And so even saying no to the doctor sometimes is okay. Like, oh, I feel guilty. I'm like, well, you know what? I'm the patient. Why do I feel guilty for telling them I can't go? Because it's not like I need to be going right now. And it's not like I'm not taking care of myself on my own. Like, I just have to remind myself. And I think I had to also grieve the loss of people misunderstanding those things, because of like, grief is so complex. People can't really see your process no matter how much they know. And I think some people just will assume that, you don't care about them anymore, or that you don't want to do those things and things like that. And to really understand that, like, you might lose people, because that's a big part of chronic illness, is grieving loss of a lot of different things. And I think with friendships or relationships, it can be like finding the people that understand you as the person you need to be, and like accept you for what that is.
Yeah.
Like, because it's enough. Like, you don't have to do all these things to make them happy, because like, I have people who will just, watch TV with me or sit with me, and like, that's how we spend time. We coexist together, and that's enough, right?
Those are the best chronic illness friendships.
Yeah, those are like the best. And I probably needed them before too. I just told myself, like, no, I need to do everything else because I'm 20 and like everyone's out there. I'm like, no, you know what? I never was that 20-year-old.
Yeah.
And I think, a way I've kind of like, because there's been especially with the pandemic and just the stage of life, like that I'm at, with like people graduating college, like beginning like real careers, like your 20s are so weird. Like, I know people that are married with babies, and then people that are going to frat parties still. Like, it's such a strange transition, but how, especially through the pandemic, how I've kind of like helped myself feel less guilty, like as friendships change and as you lose people, I will communicate before it's necessary, if that makes sense. Like, hey, like, here's what's going on, and I'm sorry if I'm MIA, but I still care about you. It's just I can't be present right now because of what's going on in my life. And communicating that before it becomes an issue. And then, if that friendship isn't sustainable, even though I communicated, then like, that's okay.
Yeah, it probably wasn't a friendship that you needed in your life.
What you needed to, you let them know. And yeah, I agree. Doing it before is 100% a lot better. And I think you have to learn how to be comfortable saying those things and, really accepting it in yourself to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And I think I definitely have gotten there more now too. And it does help. It does help. It still may hurt, but it does help. And it does, I think, show you. Yeah, it shows you that, hey, like, I did do what I could and I didn't do anything wrong. Mm-hmm. And that there are other people who do understand. And once you realize that, it's like, oh, like, I don't need them because this is nice and I deserve this,
And I don't feel, guilty for needing what I need. And
yes.
I think there are definitely, like, the pandemic has been awful, but there have been some like positives that I think we've learned as a society as we've kind of survived this collective trauma.
Yeah.
Do you like my collective trauma face?
Yes.
So to close this out, we're going to move on to a segment we like to call
Just the Tips.
Because we're 5. What are your tips for dealing with grief and chronic illness? To put you on the spot.
We can just edit.
Had so much on my mind, and now it's just like, whoop. I think the biggest thing is just knowing that wherever you are in your journey, that's right for you. You, like, regardless of where anyone else is, you are where you need to be. And that could be you know, just at the start, that could be in the middle, that could be getting to acceptance and then feeling like you're starting all over again. Like, it's just, that's how grief is. There is really no right answer. And I'm telling this to myself right now too, but it's just, I think grief and chronic illness in the body, I think that's something that we need to talk about a lot more. And if like researching or learning more about it can definitely help all of us to be kinder to ourselves and in this process. I think finding a community, a support system, kind of what I touched on earlier, is really helpful. I have to recommend therapy because therapy has changed my life. Yeah.
I'm a therapist. That's what I told my therapist a couple weeks ago, and she said, "You're the only patient that would ever say that." I said, "You're welcome."
Yeah, like I've specifically been doing art therapy, and that has really helped me to just release a lot of things and express it through art, which I've always been like someone who loves to dance and write poetry, so that's helped me a lot. So finding an outlet, I guess, that makes you feel like you can express it in a way that feels safe to you, comfortable, either for yourself or with others. You know, I think those are some of my top tips that I'm kind of going through and learning myself right now. And a gratitude journal whenever you feel like you can. I haven't been able to follow it all the time because that's just not something I can be consistent about, but it does help me to just check in every now and then. And sometimes even with just a friend to say like, oh, what did you do to like, what are your wins today, and vice versa, and kind of just to have someone, I guess, to hold you accountable a little bit. Those are some things that have really been helping me.
Love it. Well, it's been great talking to you, and I'm so glad we had this opportunity.